One phone call. That's all it took to shatter the life of one of Korea's most feared mafia bosses. Han Do-hyun, the man 3 rival organizations were too afraid to test twice. The man who had once ended a hostile takeover with nothing but a single phone call and a look in his eyes, sat frozen on the edge of his bed, staring at a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. If he hadn't, he never would have learned that the woman he'd pushed away out of fear 9 months ago had given birth to his daughter. Alone. In a country she'd immigrated to with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn hope for a better life. And she had never once picked up the phone to tell him. Nothing could have prepared him for what he found waiting there. A little child with his eyes, his smile, and a secret that would change his life forever. If you enjoy emotional romance stories like this, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us which country you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Let's go back to where it all began. A small bakery, a cup of black coffee, and a woman who refused to smile first. Rufaro Chikwava had learned that loneliness had a sound. It was the hiss of the espresso machine at 5 in the morning, the murmur of a language she was still teaching her tongue to shape, and the particular silence of a studio apartment that held no photographs on its walls because she had no one yet worth framing. She had been in Seoul for 8 months, long enough to know which bus arrived early and which arrived exactly when it wanted to. Not long enough to stop translating her thoughts from Shona to English to Korean before she spoke them aloud. A small delay that made her sound, she worried, less intelligent than she was. The bakery where she worked sat wedged between a pharmacy and a shuttered noribang, in a Gangnam side street that tourists never found. Rufaro liked it that way. She liked kneading dough at dawn, like the owner, Annie Sunja, who called her our Rufaro within the first month and meant it. She liked that flour did not care what continent had shaped her vowels. She did not, however, like the man who had started coming in every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 6:40 a.m., ordering black coffee, no sugar, and saying almost nothing. He wore suits that fit like they'd been argued into existence by someone who understood exactly how much silence a man could carry in his shoulders. 2 men in dark coats waited outside every time, standing like punctuation marks on either side of the door. Auntie Sunja had once whispered, half thrilled and half terrified, that he was someone, the kind of someone Seoul did not ask questions about. Rufaro didn't need to be told twice. She'd grown up watching her mother navigate men who thought their money made them owed something. She kept her exchanges with him brief, professional, and entirely free of the warmth she gave every other customer. "You never smile at me," he said one Friday, sliding exact change across the counter instead of a card. She blinked. It was the first full sentence he'd offered her that wasn't an order. "I smile at people who smile first." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. "Han Do-hyun," he said, as if that settled something. "I know who you are," she said carefully. "Everyone thinks they know who I am." He picked up his coffee. "You didn't ask." She hadn't. And that, apparently, interested him more than anything else in the room. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Friday after. He began arriving a few minutes early, before the shop properly opened, when Annie Sunja was still in the back with the radio, playing trot music too loudly to eavesdrop. He would stand near the window with his coffee and, slowly, begin to talk. Not about himself, never about himself, not at first, but about the city. Which noodle shop stayed open latest? Why Namsan Tower looked better in fog than in sunlight? He asked her once, unprompted, if Seoul's winters had shocked her. "I did not know cold could hurt," she admitted. "In Harare, winter is a sweater. Here it is a war." He laughed, a short, surprised sound, like he hadn't expected himself to make it. "You should let me show you where to buy a coat that actually works. Koreans overpay for fashion and underpay for warmth." "Is that an offer, Mr. Han?" "It's an observation." A pause. "But yes." She should have said no. Everything about him. The bodyguards, the reputation Auntie Sunja spoke of only in hushed vowels, The careful blankness he wore like armor told her to keep the counter between them and nothing more. But there was something else in him too, something lonelier than his suit suggested, and Rufaro recognized loneliness the way one recognizes a language spoken in a familiar accent. "Tuesday," she said. "After my shift." He nodded once, like a man closing a business deal, and left before she could see whatever expression crossed his face next. She spent the rest of that day annoyed with herself, and even more annoyed at how much she was looking forward to Tuesday. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed listening to the refrigerator hum its one tuneless note, she found herself replaying the conversation the way she used to replay her university lectures back home, searching for the parts she might have misunderstood. "You never smile at me." Not an accusation. Almost, if she let herself believe it, a confession. She thought of her mother's voice, the one that had followed her all the way from Harare to Incheon Airport. Rufaro, a woman alone in a strange country, must plant her own garden before she borrows anyone else's shade. She had taken the word seriously. She had built her small, careful life exactly that way. Flour under her fingernails, rent paid on time, a bank account that grew slower than she liked, but grew nonetheless. She had not planned for a man like Han Do-hyun to wander into that garden and stand there, watching, as though he had never seen anything allowed to grow so plainly before. Auntie Soonja noticed her distraction the next morning, watching Rufaro measure flour twice into the same bowl. "You are thinking of the quiet one," the older woman said, not a question. "I am thinking of closing the register properly," Rufaro said, which was not an answer either of them believed. "He has not smiled at anyone in this shop in 2 years," Auntie Soonja said, wiping down the counter with more focus than the task required. "Not even at me, and I make excellent pastries. Be careful, our Rufaro. Men like that do not smile easily, but when they do, they mean it with their whole chest." Rufaro said nothing, but she found herself glancing at the door every time the bell above it rang for the rest of the week, and each time it wasn't him, she was surprised by the small, foolish drop of disappointment in her stomach. The coat shop Do-hyun took her to was not, as she expected, some glittering boutique meant to impress. It was a narrow shop in Yeoljiro run by an old tailor who greeted Do-hyun not with fear, but with the easy familiarity of someone who had known him since before the suits, before the bodyguards, before whatever had hardened his jaw into something permanent. "Grandfather made my father's coats," Do-hyun explained while the old man fussed over Rufaro's shoulders with a measuring tape. "And mine, when I was small enough to need his help zipping them." "You were small once?" Rufaro asked, deadpan. "I find that difficult to imagine. I had a growth spurt at 16 that terrified my mother." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother. Rufaro filed it away carefully, the way she filed away every small true thing he offered, because she sensed he did not offer them often. The coat, when it was finished 2 weeks later, was a deep forest green that made her feel, for the first time since arriving in Korea, like the season didn't own her. "It's beautiful," she said, turning in front of the shop's narrow mirror. "It suits you," he said, and something in his voice made Grandfather O glance between them with the knowing amusement of a man who had seen this particular story before. Their Tuesdays became a ritual neither of them named. He would walk her partway home after her shift, past the stalls selling roasted chestnuts, past the church whose bells rang slightly out of tune. He asked about Zimbabwe the way most Koreans never had, not out of polite curiosity meant to fill silence, but because he genuinely wanted the shape of the place that had made her. "Tell me about the celebrations," he said one evening, breath fogging in the cold. "The ones that matter most." So she told him about Kurova Guva, the ceremony that welcomed ancestors home. About how weddings back home lasted for days. How the whole village fed the couple before they fed themselves. How her grandmother's beer and music could make grown men weep without a single word sung. He listened with a stillness she wasn't used to receiving from anyone, let alone a man reputed to make grown men flinch. "Your turn," she said. Tell me something true. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse. I was married, he finally said. For 3 years. It ended 4 months ago. I'm sorry. Don't be. She was unhappy long before she was unfaithful. I was too busy being feared to notice I wasn't being loved. He said it without self-pity, a simple accounting of facts, though something in his jaw tightened. I don't tell people that. I don't know why I told you. Maybe, Rufaro said gently, because I don't want anything from you. He looked at her then in a way that made the cold air feel suddenly unimportant. That, he said, might be the rarest thing I've encountered in years. They kept walking, past a chestnut vendor who called out to Do-hyun using a nickname Rufaro didn't recognize, past a cluster of schoolgirls who went comically silent at the sight of him before dissolving into whispers once he'd passed. Rufaro noticed how he moved through the city like a man who had memorized every exit from every room, and wondered what it cost to carry that kind of vigilance since childhood. Does it ever stop? She asked. The noticing? The exits, the corners, the people who might mean you harm. He glanced at her, surprised she'd seen it at all. No, it becomes background noise. Like breathing. You forget you're doing it until someone points it out. A pause. You're the first person in a long time who's pointed it out instead of pretending not to notice. I notice things, she said simply. It's how I've survived being new here. You learn to read a room quickly when you don't yet speak its language. What do you read in this one? She considered the darkening street, the fairy lights strung above a tekbaki cart, the two of them slowing their pace without either quite deciding to. That you're lonelier than the suits suggest. That you don't know what to do with someone who isn't afraid of you and isn't trying to use you. That you're deciding, right now, whether it's safe to let me keep noticing. He didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had lost its careful edges. You should be afraid of me. Most people have the sense to be. I didn't say I wasn't afraid, Rufaro said. I said I wasn't only that. The distinction seemed to land somewhere important in him. He walked her the rest of the way to her building in a silence that felt, for the first time, comfortable rather than guarded, and when he said goodnight at her door, he lingered a half-second longer than necessary before turning back into the dark, shoulders slightly less armored than they'd been an hour before. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in Seoul, cherry blossoms appearing overnight like a rumor confirmed. By then, Do-hyun's visits to the bakery had stopped being about coffee entirely, though he still ordered it, still paid exact change, still let Annie Soonja pretend she wasn't matchmaking from behind the pastry case. His bodyguards, a broad, quiet man named Hyun-woo and a younger one called Suk-jin who blushed whenever Rufaro spoke to him directly, had gradually stopped waiting outside and started sitting at the corner table, nursing their own coffees, pretending not to listen. You're smiling more, Hyun-woo told her once, when Do-hyun had stepped out to take a call, his voice suddenly clipped and businesslike in a way that always made the temperature of the room drop. He doesn't usually let people see him like this. Like what? Unarmed, Hyun-woo said simply, and returned to his coffee before she could ask him to explain. Rufaro was beginning to understand what he meant. The man who visited her on Tuesdays and Fridays was gentler than the one Seoul feared, patient with her broken Korean, delighted rather than embarrassed by her mistakes. I go to the bathroom, she told him proudly one afternoon, having finally mastered a phrase that had eluded her for weeks. Almost, he said, fighting a smile. You just told me you're going to marry the bathroom. She threw a balled-up napkin at him. He caught it without looking, which felt entirely unfair. Their laughter, once it started, rarely stopped for long. He tried her cooking one evening in her small apartment. She'd made sadza and a peanut butter and greens stew, nervous in a way she hadn't expected to be. He took one bite, went very still, and then reached for a second, larger portion before finishing the first. This is, he searched for the word, honest food. It doesn't hide behind anything. High praise from a man who eats truffle everything. I eat what's put in front of me by people who matter. He said it lightly, but she heard the weight underneath and didn't push. Some sentences needed room to breathe before they could be answered. It was Suk-jin, blushing furiously, who finally handed her a small paper bag one Friday while Do-hyun argued with Auntie Sunja about the correct way to fold a dumpling. "He asked me to get this," Suk-jin whispered. "Don't tell him I said it's not really for you. It's for himself. He's just 2, he doesn't do this." Inside was a small carved wooden hairpin, traditional and clearly expensive, shaped like a magnolia. "Boss saw it in a shop window 3 weeks ago," Suk-jin murmured. "He's walked past it every single day since deciding whether to buy it." Rufaro looked across the counter at Do-hyun, who was now laughing. Actually laughing, unguarded, at something Auntie Sunja had said, and felt something in her chest crack open, warm and terrifying all at once. She was falling in love with a man an entire city was afraid of, and for the first time since she'd landed in Korea alone, she did not feel afraid of anything at all. Later that night, he found an excuse to walk her home again, though the bakery was long closed and there was no shift to see her out of. They stopped at a small park halfway between his apartment and hers, empty at that hour except for a lone vending machine humming beneath a street lamp. "Ask me something," he said, buying them both hot barley tea from the machine and pressing a can into her cold hands. "Anything. I find I want you to know things about me before someone else tells you a worse version." She turned the can over in her palms, considering. "Why bodyguards?" "Truly, not the business answer. My father was shot in front of me when I was 14. He said it plainly, the way a man recites a fact he has made peace with only by repeating it until it stopped drawing blood. Rival organization. I watched it happen from the back seat of a car I wasn't supposed to be in that day. After that, my mother insisted on protection for me at all times, whether I wanted it or not. I hated it for years. Now I understand it was the only love language she had left to offer a son who was about to inherit a world she despised." Rufaro said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of it settle without rushing to fill the silence with comfort he hadn't asked for. "Is she still alive? Your mother?" "She lives outside Busan. We speak twice a month, mostly about nothing. She has never once asked what I do for a living, and I have never once told her. It is the only way we manage to still love each other properly." A small, rueful smile. "Your turn. Something true. I have not told my mother about you," Rufaro admitted. "Not because I'm ashamed. Because I don't yet know what you are to me, and I don't want to name it wrong and have to take it back." "What would you name it, if you were forced to guess?" She looked at him over the rim of the warm can, feeling the honest answer rise before she could talk herself out of it. "Something I didn't plan for. Something I'm glad happened anyway." He didn't smile this time, but something in his face eased, the way a held breath finally lets go, and they sat together on the cold park bench a while longer, in no hurry at all to name it further. Love, Rufaro was learning, did not arrive the way films promised, not as lightning, but as weather, gradual and total, until one day she looked up and realized the entire sky had changed color. It arrived in small rituals. Sunday mornings spent teaching him Shono words he mangled beautifully. Evenings spent on his rooftop terrace overlooking the Han River while he pointed out landmarks and told her their histories. Unprompted trips to the African grocery store 2 subway lines away because he'd heard her mention missing the taste of dried kapenta. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, watching him navigate the cramped aisles with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I wanted to see what made you," he said simply, holding up a bag of mopane worms with visible suspicion. "Though I reserve judgment on this particular item." "Coward. Strategist," he corrected, setting it back on the shelf with great ceremony. He met her at the small Zimbabwean community gathering she'd found through a church group, standing at the edge of the room in his expensive coat looking entirely out of place and entirely unwilling to leave her side. When the music started, real bira, played by a woman who'd brought her instrument all the way from Utare, Rufaro pulled him into the dancing before he could protest. He was terrible at it. stiff, overthinking every movement, counting under his breath. She laughed so hard she had to hold his arm to stay upright, and he didn't seem to mind losing at something for once in his life, not when it made her laugh like that. Their first kiss happened not with fireworks, but with quiet. On that rooftop, city lights scattered below them like something spilled and beautiful, both of them worn soft by an evening of easy conversation. He touched her face like he expected her to disappear, like the reputation that made grown men step aside for him meant nothing here, in this smaller, truer version of his life. "I don't know how to do this slowly," he admitted against her forehead. "I've never done anything slowly." "Then let me teach you," she whispered. "I'm good at patience. I've had practice." He learned. Every date, every conversation, every hand held a little longer than necessary. He learned patience the way he seemed to learn everything, with total, disciplined focus. Except this focus was soft where his other focuses were sharp. When they finally came together fully, months into their careful courtship, it was in the quiet of her small apartment, with her forest green coat hung by the door and rain against the window. She had never done this before, had waited for a reason she couldn't fully articulate until now, and he treated the fact with a reverence that surprised her, slow, unhurried, entirely present, whispering against her skin in a mixture of Korean and broken Shona that made her laugh even as her eyes filled. "I love you," he said afterward, into her hair, like the words cost him something and he'd decided to pay it anyway. "I did not expect to say that again. Not after." "I know," she said, and meant it. "I'm not her, and you don't have to compare us." "I'm not comparing." His arms tightened around her. "I'm just afraid of how much this matters." She should have listened more closely to that fear. She would remember, much later, that fear does not simply disappear because love arrives to sit beside it. Sometimes it waits. The trouble did not announce itself with violence, not at first. It announced itself in the way Do-hyun's phone began ringing at 3 a.m., in the way Hyun-woo and Suk-jin's postures grew tighter, in the way Do-hyun started arriving at the bakery late, distracted, his easy laughter replaced by a vigilance that made Auntie Soonja quietly usher her other customers out the back. "Talk to me," Rufaro said one night, finding him standing at his apartment window instead of in bed beside her. "It's business. It's always business with you, when it's something you don't want me carrying." He turned, and for a moment she saw the mask completely. The version of him Seoul feared, cold and calculating, before it slipped and left only exhaustion behind. "A rival organization believes I'm weak because of the divorce. They're testing boundaries. Testing me." His jaw worked. "If they learn you exist to me, what you are to me, you become a boundary too. A weakness they'll exploit. So don't tell me anything real, and I'll be safer?" Her voice rose despite herself. "Is that the plan?" "The plan is to keep you alive," he snapped, sharper than he'd ever spoken to her, and then visibly recoiled from his own tone. "Rufaro, I'm sorry. I don't know how to love someone and protect them at the same time. I've never had to before." Seo-yun never needed protecting from anything but her own boredom. The comparison, even unintentional, landed like a slap. "I am not her," Rufaro said quietly. "Stop measuring me against a woman who didn't want what you were offering. I do. I just want you to trust me enough to let me stand beside you instead of behind glass." He didn't answer. That was the problem. He never quite answered, not with the honesty this moment demanded. Instead, he pulled her close and held on like something might tear her from his arms at any second, and she let him, because she loved him, but she noticed, with a small cold clarity, that holding on tightly was not the same as opening up. In the days after that argument, he tried, in his own limited way, to make amends without ever quite admitting what needed amending. He sent Hyun-woo to walk her home instead of coming himself, a substitution she resented more than she expected to. He left a bag of imported South African rooibos tea on her doorstep with no note. as though the gesture might speak a language his mouth couldn't manage. She drank the tea and stayed angry anyway, because tea was not the same as talking, and she had grown up watching men mistake one for the other. "He's not sleeping," Auntie Sunja mentioned one morning, watching Rufaro knead dough with more force than the recipe strictly required. Sukjin says he sits in his office until 2, 3 in the morning, staring at nothing. "That is his choice," Rufaro said, though her hands slowed. Choices are rarely as simple as we pretend, when fear is the one making them. Auntie Sunja patted her shoulder once, gently, and said nothing further, letting the words sit exactly where Rufaro needed them to. 2 weeks later, a car followed her home from the bakery. Nothing happened. Hyunwoo intercepted it before it came near her, but Do-hyun's reaction was not relief. It was retreat. "I need you to stay away for a while," he told her, standing in her doorway like a stranger, his face arranged into the careful blankness she hadn't seen directed at her in months. "Until this settles. It isn't safe. Then let me help you make it safe. Don't disappear on me the way everyone in my life eventually does." "I'm not disappearing. I'm protecting you the only way I know how." "You're protecting yourself," she said, and the truth of it hit them both at once. "From feeling something you can't control. This isn't about the danger, Do-hyun. This is about you deciding, again, that loving someone means eventually losing them, so you'd rather leave first." He said nothing. The silence stretched, unbearable, and she realized with a heartbreak so quiet it barely made a sound that he wasn't going to argue with her, because some small, cowardly part of him agreed. She closed the door before he could see her cry. She did not yet know she was carrying his child. She would find out 3 weeks later, alone in a clinic waiting room, and she would decide, in that same quiet moment, that she would not go back to a man who chose fear over her. Not even for this. Not even for the small, astonishing fact now growing beneath her heart. Rufaro named her daughter Tapawa. "We have been given, because despite everything, despite the fear and the fights and the silence that had followed her out of Do-hyun's life, the child growing inside her had never once felt like a mistake. She felt like a gift arriving through a door she hadn't known was open." She did not call Do-hyun. She told herself it was pride, and some of it was, but more of it was the memory of his face in that doorway, choosing distance over her, and the fear that if she told him about the baby, he would choose the same thing again, this time with a child's heart to break instead of just her own. Auntie Sunja found out first, catching Rufaro crying in the bakery's small back room over a wave of nausea she couldn't hide. She didn't ask who the father was. She simply held Rufaro's hand and said, "Our Rufaro is never alone. Not in this shop." And then she quietly rearranged the schedule so Rufaro could work mornings only, and never once mentioned the money missing from the till that somehow always seemed to cover Rufaro's growing list of needs. The pregnancy was not easy. Rufaro worked through most of it, her body changing in a country that had never fully learned to see her, navigating doctor's appointments in a language still imperfect in her mouth, sending video calls home to a mother in Harare who cried with joy and worry in equal measure and begged her to come home. "I built something here, Amai," Rufaro told her gently. "I'm not running from it just because it got harder." Tapawa arrived on a rain-soaked morning in October, 7 pounds of fury and lungs, with a head of dark curling hair and a stubborn set to her small jaw that made Auntie Sunja gasp the moment she saw her. "She has his eyes," the older woman whispered, before catching herself. "She has her own eyes," Rufaro corrected, exhausted and fierce, cradling her daughter like a verdict she intended to defend. "She's not a copy of anyone. She's herself." But privately, alone in the hospital room at night, Rufaro let herself really look, at the shape of her daughter's face, the particular curve of her mouth when she yawned, and felt an ache she refused to name settle somewhere beneath her ribs. She built a life around her daughter with the same discipline she'd once admired in Do-hyun, without ever making the connection aloud. She found a small apartment closer to the bakery. She taught herself to braid Tapawa's hair while singing the same lullabies her own mother had sung to her, blending Shona words with the Korean nursery songs Auntie Sunja hummed while minding the baby during Rufuro's shifts. She was, by any measure, thriving, proof to herself and to the version of Do-hyun that still lived rent-free in her memory that she had never needed rescuing. There were small victories she counted like currency. The first time Tapawa slept through the night. The first time Rufuro successfully argued down a landlord in Korean without her voice shaking. The day she was finally promoted to managing the bakery's morning shift entirely on her own. A title Annie Sunja announced with the ceremony of a woman bestowing a crown. She sent photos home to Harare weekly. Tapawa in a tiny knitted hat. Tapawa attempting to eat a spoon. Tapawa asleep in the flower-dusted embrace of a woman who had once been a stranger and was now, unmistakably, family. There were harder nights too, ones she didn't photograph. Nights when Tapawa ran a fever and Rufuro sat awake translating symptoms into a pharmacy app at 2 a.m., aching with the specific loneliness of decisions no one else was there to share. Nights when she watched other mothers at the park meet their husbands at the gate and felt something in her chest pull tight, not with envy exactly, but with the sharp awareness of a weight she carried entirely without a second pair of hands. She never let the ache linger long enough to become bitterness. She had come to Korea to build something, and she reminded herself, some nights fiercely, that she had built it. A daughter who giggled at nothing, a shop that felt like home, a version of herself steadier and braver than the girl who'd landed at Incheon 18 months before, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But some nights, watching Tapawa's small fist curl around her finger with a strength that felt entirely inherited, Rufuro wondered whether the man who'd taught her to dance badly on a rooftop overlooking the Han River deserved to know that a piece of him was growing up without him, laughing his exact laugh at things that weren't even funny yet. She wasn't ready to find out what would happen if she told him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Fate, it turned out, had other plans. Do-hyun had spent 9 months turning his organization's chaos into order and his personal life into a museum of things he refused to touch. He'd handled the rival gang's incursions with the ruthless efficiency Seoul expected of him, dismantling their small provocations one by one until the threat that had once frightened him into pushing Rufuro away had been reduced to nothing but a rumor other men told each other to feel important. He had won. He told himself that often, in the quiet after each victory, and found the word tasted like ash every single time. He had not handled, in any efficient way, the fact that he thought about Rufuro every single day, that he'd walked past the bakery twice and turned around both times, that Grandfather had asked, gently, whatever happened to the young lady with the beautiful coat? And Do-hyun hadn't had an answer that didn't taste like the same ash. He had thrown himself into work the way he'd once thrown himself into learning to dance for her. Badly, stubbornly, hoping repetition might eventually produce something that resembled peace. It never did. He signed contracts and settled disputes and sat through board meetings for legitimate businesses he built as a hedge against a criminal world he increasingly wanted his life to outgrow, and none of it filled the specific silence she had left behind. Hyun-woo, who had never been a man of many words, had taken to leaving the bakery's name unmentioned in his presence entirely, the way one avoids a bruise still tender to the touch. It was Suk-jin, younger and less careful, who once asked if Do-hyun ever planned to go back and simply apologize. Do-hyun had not answered. He had simply looked out the window of his office at the city that feared him and thought, not for the first time, that fear had never once kept him warm. The call came on an ordinary Thursday evening, from a number he didn't recognize, and he almost let it go to voicemail the way he let most unknown numbers go. He didn't. Some instinct, some old aching hope, made him answer. Han Do-hyun. The voice was unfamiliar, older, careful, speaking English with an accent that took him a moment to place. "Who is this?" "My name is Annie Sunja. I own the bakery where Rufaro works." A pause thick with deliberation. "I found your number in her old phone. She would be furious with me for calling. I am calling anyway, because I am old enough not to care about her fury as much as I care about doing what is right." His entire body had gone still. "Is she all right? Is something wrong?" "She is fine. She is more than fine. She is one of the strongest women I have ever known." Another pause, longer this time, and when Auntie Sunja spoke again, her voice carried the particular weight of a sentence about to change a life. "But you have a daughter, Mr. Han. 9 months old. Her name is Tapawa. And Rufaro has raised her alone this entire time and said nothing to you. And I think perhaps you deserve to know, even if she never forgives me for telling you." The phone nearly slipped from his hand. "A daughter," he repeated, the words foreign in his own mouth, too large to fit around anything he understood about himself. "You're certain?" "I have watched that child grow for 9 months, Mr. Han. I have never seen a face so clearly borrowed from someone else." Auntie Sunja's voice softened, the sternness giving way to something almost pleading. "She looks exactly like you, down to the way she frowns when she's thinking too hard." He sat down heavily on the edge of his own bed, in the apartment that had felt like a museum for 9 months, and found that his hands were shaking in a way no rival gang had ever managed to produce. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because a child should know her father, if her father is willing to be known properly. Not as a shadow, not as someone she resents for arriving late." A breath, steadying itself on the other end of the line. "And because I watched that woman love you enough to build an entire life just to protect what was left of her heart from you. I think, if you were the man she once described to me, patient underneath all that fear, you owe her the chance to see whether you've grown into him." Do-hyun closed his eyes. 9 months of silence unspooled behind them. Every night he'd told himself distance was protection, every choice that had, in the end, protected nothing but his own fear of losing something the way he'd lost his marriage. "Tell me where," he said, voice rough. "Please, tell me where to find them." Rufaro was folding laundry, Tapawa babbling nonsense syllables from her playmat on the floor, when the knock came. She wasn't expecting anyone. Annie Sunja had left an hour ago, suspiciously flustered for reasons Rufaro hadn't had time to interrogate, and she nearly didn't answer, except Tapawa's babbling had turned into the particular delighted shriek she reserved for new and interesting sounds. She opened the door, and the entire hallway seemed to tilt. Do-hyun stood there in a coat far less expensive than the one she remembered, his face thinner, older somehow, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made 9 months collapse into nothing and everything at once. "How did you?" she started, and then understanding arrived, cold and immediate. "Sunja, don't be angry with her." His voice cracked slightly on the words. "Be angry with me. I earned it." Tapawa, unbothered by adult devastation, chose that moment to crawl determinately toward the door, drawn by the new voice. Do-hyun's gaze dropped, and Rufaro watched something happen to his face that she had genuinely never seen before. Not fear, not the careful blankness he wore like armor, but a complete, undefended collapse of every wall he'd built in his entire adult life. "She's," his voice failed entirely. "Tapawa," Rufaro said quietly. "It means we have been given." He crouched slowly, carefully, the way one might approach something sacred and easily frightened, and Tapawa studied him with the frank, unblinking assessment only babies are capable of, before reaching out and grabbing a fistful of his hair with a delighted crow of triumph. Do-hyun laughed, a broken, wet sound that turned instantly into something closer to weeping, and did not pull away. "I'm sorry," he said, to Tapawa, to Rufaro, to the 9 months he could never get back. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I chose fear instead of you. Both of you." You don't get to apologize your way back into her life, Rufaro said, arms crossed, though her voice shook. Or mine. Not with words. I've raised her alone for 9 months. Do-hyun. I built a life that doesn't have a hole shaped like you in it. And I won't let you walk in and rearrange everything, because you finally found your courage. I know. He rose slowly, Tapawa's fist still wrapped in his hair, forcing him to hold her rather than simply hold himself. I'm not asking to rearrange anything. I'm asking for the chance to earn a place in whatever you've built. However long that takes. However small a place it is. That's not how this works. You can't just. I'm not leaving, Rufaro. His voice was steady now, stripped of the fear that had once sent him retreating from her doorway. I left once already. I know exactly what that cost us. I am not making that mistake twice, whether you forgive me tomorrow or in 10 years. I will be here, every day, until you believe it. Tapawa, sensing the gravity of the moment in the way babies sometimes inexplicably do, patted his cheek with a small, damp hand and babbled something that sounded remarkably like a decision already made. Rufaro looked at her daughter's hand against the face of the man who'd broken her heart and felt the careful architecture of her anger begin, despite every instinct telling her not to let it, to crack. Prove it, she said finally. Don't tell me. Show me. Every day, he repeated. Starting now. He didn't leave that evening. Not entirely. He sat on her small couch while she finished folding laundry, refusing anything more than the corner she offered him, watching Tapawa play with the fierce attention of a man memorizing something he was terrified to lose twice. When it came time for her nap, he asked, quietly, if he could be the one to carry her to the crib, and Rufaro let him, watching from the doorway as he held their daughter with the exaggerated, careful stillness of someone certain he would break her simply by existing too close. You won't break her, she said softly from the doorway. I broke us, he said, not looking up from the small sleeping face in his arms. Forgive me for being afraid of doing it again. Then be careful, Rufaro said. Not distant. There's a difference, and it took me 9 months to learn it without you here to teach me. He nodded and laid Tapawa down with a gentleness that made something in Rufaro's chest, guarded so long and so carefully, ache with the effort of not softening entirely all at once. Before he left that night, standing again at the door where he'd first reappeared, he turned back once. I'm not asking you to trust me tonight, he said. I know better than that now. I'm only asking you not to close this door completely. Leave it cracked. I'll do the rest of the work myself. Rufaro considered him for a long moment. The thinner face, the humility that hadn't been there 9 months ago, the way he'd held their daughter like something worth more than every empire he'd ever built. Tuesday, she said finally, echoing the word that had started everything so long ago. Come Tuesday. We'll see. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door, cracked open just enough for hope to slip through. He was terrible at diapers. This became apparent almost immediately, on his 3rd visit, when he'd insisted on attempting the task himself, while Rufaro watched with her arms crossed and her mouth fighting a smile she refused to give him. It's not supposed to face this way, is it? He said, holding Tapawa's diaper at an angle that suggested engineering had failed him entirely. You run an empire, Rufaro said, and you cannot manage a diaper. An empire doesn't wriggle. Tapawa, as if to prove his point, chose that exact moment to roll away from him entirely, shrieking with laughter at his visible panic. She's doing this on purpose. She's 9 months old. She's clearly a prodigy. By the 4th attempt he'd more or less mastered it. Though Hyun-woo, who had taken to visiting under the transparent pretense of security detail, and was very obviously there because he adored the baby, still occasionally had to intervene when Do-hyun's careful, controlled hands proved too tentative for the task. Suk-jin had taken to bringing small toys every visit, blushing furiously whenever Rufaro thanked him, until an entire corner of her apartment had quietly transformed into a shrine of stuffed animals gifted by Seoul's most feared men. The days accumulated slowly, ordinarily, the way trust is actually rebuilt. Not through grand gestures, but through Tuesdays where he arrived on time. Evenings where he stayed through Tapawa's entire bedtime routine without checking his phone once. Mornings where he showed up with coffee for Rufaro and a small container of mashed sweet potato he'd learned, through trial and considerable error, was Tapawa's favorite. He learned to say, "I love you," in Shona, mangling it charmingly at first, then perfectly, whispering it against Tapawa's forehead every time he left, as though the words might not survive the distance otherwise. He learned, too, to talk to Rufaro honestly, the way he hadn't managed before, telling her about the fear that had driven him away, about a childhood where his own father had taught him that love was a liability men in his position couldn't afford, about the slow, humiliating work of unlearning that lesson one visit at a time. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did," he told her one evening, both of them sitting on her small balcony while Tapawa slept inside. "I'm asking you to let me keep proving I've changed. For as long as it takes." "It's taking," she admitted quietly. "I notice it. I'm not blind to it." There were entire Sunday afternoons that dissolved into nothing more dramatic than the three of them at the park. Do-hyun pushing Tapawa's stroller with the exaggerated caution of a bomb disposal expert, while Rufaro laughed at him from the bench, unable to help herself. There was the evening he attempted, at Rufaro's insistence, to try mazando, a rich, slow-cooked dish of trotters her mother had once mailed the recipe for, and went very quiet for a long moment before admitting, with visible reluctance, that it was aggressively good, in a way I resent. "You resent good food?" "I resent that I now crave something I can't easily find in Seoul." He'd looked genuinely betrayed by his own palate, and Rufaro had laughed so hard Tapawa was startled awake and joined in without understanding why, which only made them both laugh harder. There were harder evenings, too. Nights he arrived late for meetings he wouldn't fully explain, his jaw set in the old careful blankness, and Rufaro had learned to wait him out rather than press, trusting that the honesty he'd promised would come once he'd found the words instead of forcing it before he was ready. It always came, eventually, sometimes fumbling, sometimes graceless, but it came. Danger arrived. When it did, almost gently by comparison to the emotional storms that had preceded it. A rival faction, sensing weakness in Do-hyun's newly visible domestic life, made one clumsy attempt to use Rufaro as leverage, a car parked too long outside her building, a man asking too many questions at the bakery. Hyunwoo intercepted it before it became anything more than a threat, and Do-hyun's response was swift, decisive, and utterly without the hesitation that had once cost him everything. He arrived at Rufaro's apartment that night not as the careful, humbled man learning fatherhood one diaper at a time, but as the man Seoul feared, cold, precise, giving instructions to Hyunwoo in a clipped voice that made Rufaro understand, for the first time fully, the scale of the world he'd spent months trying to keep separate from theirs. It should have frightened her. Instead, watching him check every window and lock with methodical calm, Tapawa balanced on his hip the entire time as though he refused to set her down even for efficiency's sake. She felt something closer to safety than fear. "You're not going to send us away this time," she said, not quite a question. "No." He didn't look up from the window latch he was testing. "I spent 9 months learning that the only thing worse than danger is doing nothing while pretending it's protection. You stay. We face it together, or we don't face it at all." "I should have told you the truth from the beginning," he said afterward, holding Rufaro while she processed the fear of it, Tapawa asleep between them. "Not protected you from it. Trusted you with it." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have. I'm telling you now. Everything. No more doors closed between us." And for the first time since he'd knocked on her door 9 months into fatherhood, Rufaro let herself believe he meant it completely. The proposal, when it came, was not extravagant. Do-hyun had learned, over months of showing up, that Rufaro did not want grand gestures dressed up as apologies. She wanted consistency, and consistency was the only currency he now trusted himself to spend. A year had passed since he'd knocked on her door with 9 months of absence behind him. In that year, he had sold 2 of his organization's more questionable holdings and quietly redirected the proceeds into a scholarship fund for immigrant workers navigating Seoul without family. A decision he made without telling her, though she found out anyway, the way she found out most of the good things he did without asking for credit. He had met Rufaro's mother over a video call that lasted 3 hours and ended with the older woman informing her daughter, in rapid Shona, she assumed he couldn't follow, that the quiet one has kind eyes, even if he stirs the pot like it insulted him. He had learned, finally and completely, that love was not a weakness men in his position couldn't afford. It was the only thing that had ever made his life feel worth protecting at all. It happened on a Tuesday, fittingly, in the small apartment that had become, without either of them quite naming it, something like a shared home. Tapawa, now walking in the wobbling, triumphant way of a child who has just discovered her own power, toddled between them while a pot of sadza simmered on the stove. His attempt this time, guided patiently over the phone by Rufaro's mother in Harare, who had finally, grudgingly, begun to approve of him. "Your mother says I stir too aggressively," he reported, wooden spoon in hand, utterly serious. "My mother says a lot of things. She's usually right." He set the spoon down and turned to face her fully, and something in his posture made Rufaro go still. "Rufaro, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm not asking because of fear or guilt, or because I think it fixes anything I broke. I'm asking because every single day I've spent earning my way back into your life has been the only part of my life that has ever felt like it mattered completely." He didn't kneel with a velvet box, didn't summon musicians or fireworks. He simply took her hands, flour-dusted and steady, and held them the way he'd once held Tapawa on that first devastating visit, carefully, like something he intended never to drop again. "Marry me, not because it's owed. Because I choose you, every day, the way I've been choosing you every day since I found the courage to knock on this door. I want to build the rest of my life in a home with your laugh in it, and her running through it, and no more doors closed between any of us." Rufaro looked at him for a long moment. This man who had once chosen fear over her, who had spent months rebuilding, brick by patient brick, the trust he'd shattered, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that the answer had been ready inside her for longer than she'd admitted even to herself. "Ask me properly," she said, voice thick. "In Shona, you've been practicing." He had. His accent was imperfect. The words slightly stumbled, but they landed with a sincerity that made her laugh and cry in the same breath. And when he finished, Tapawa, perhaps sensing that this moment required participation, toddled over and placed her small hand over both of theirs, babbling something triumphant and entirely her own. "Yes," Rufaro said, to him, to the small insistent hand atop theirs, to the life they were choosing to build in the open instead of behind closed doors. "Yes, Do-hyun. Yes." He kissed her the way he had that first night on his rooftop, slow and reverent. Except this time, there was no fear trembling beneath it. Only certainty, hard-won and entirely earned. The wedding took place in early spring, beneath a canopy of cherry blossoms in a garden grandfather O had insisted on, refusing payment, calling it his gift to the boy who finally learned to stop running. They married twice within the same ceremony, weaving both worlds together with the same care Rufaro had once used to braid her daughter's hair. A Korean piebeak took place first, Do-hyun's remaining family bowing formally as Rufaro, resplendent in a hanbok the color of the coat he'd once bought her, caught the dates and chestnuts thrown for fertility and laughed when Tapawa, unable to resist a game, toddled forward to catch a few herself. Then came the Zimbabwean Rora blessing, adapted with grace and blended traditions, Rufuro's mother flown in for the occasion, weeping openly as she blessed the union in Shona while in Bira player, the same woman from the community gathering years before, filled the garden with music older than either of their country's borders. Du Hyun, in a traditional hanbok jacket paired unexpectedly with a scarf Rufuro's mother had woven from Zimbabwean cotton, danced badly again during the reception, exactly as he had that very first time. And this time no one laughed harder than his own daughter, perched on Hyunwoo's shoulders, clapping along offbeat with the fierce joy of a child who had never once doubted her parents belonged together. Auntie Sunja cried through the entire ceremony and took full, unrepentant credit for it afterward. "I made one phone call," she told anyone who would listen, "and look what grew from it." Sukjin, no longer blushing quite so easily, but still hopelessly sentimental, had arranged an entire table of stuffed animals as a centerpiece for Tapawa's honor guard, which Rufuro's mother declared the strangest and most touching wedding decoration she had ever encountered in either of her countries. Hyunwoo gave a toast in halting, carefully rehearsed Shona that made Rufuro's mother weep all over again, thanking Rufuro for teaching a man who had spent his whole career guarding others how it felt to be trusted enough to guard something soft. Grandfather Oh, watching from a seat of honor near the front, caught Do-hyun's eye once during the reception and simply nodded, the particular, wordless approval of a man who had measured him since boyhood and finally, after so many quiet years, found the accounting satisfactory. Later, as the sun set gold over the garden and the guests drifted into easy conversation over shared plates of both bulgogi and sadza, Do-hyun found Rufuro standing alone for a rare quiet moment, watching their daughter attempt, with great seriousness, to teach Hyunwoo the correct way to say thank you in Shona. "No regrets?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "None," she said, leaning into him without hesitation, the way she'd once been too guarded to allow. "Every hard thing led here. I wouldn't erase a single one of them, not even the ones that broke my heart. I will spend every day making sure it was worth it," he murmured against her hair. "You already have," she said. "You just needed time to believe it yourself." Above them, the cherry blossoms let go of their petals one by one, drifting down over a family built from two continents, one broken heart mended by patience, and a small, fierce daughter who had, without ever knowing it, brought her parents home to each other.